Marcus Reeves heard them before he saw them. Not hoofbeats exactly, but something deeper, a tremor in the ground that made the tin cups rattle against the wooden table. He stepped onto his porch as the sun broke over the ridge, and his blood turned to ice water. 500 Apache warriors lined the hills surrounding his ranch, motionless as statues carved from the desert itself. Rifles rested across saddles. War shields caught the early light, every eye fixed on him with an intensity that could melt iron. In front stood a chief whose presence alone commanded silence from the morning wind. Marcus's throat went dry because he knew exactly why they'd come, and the answer was sleeping in his barn. 72 hours earlier, Marcus had been counting his failures. His wife's grave stood 3 years cold on the hillside. The bank owned more of his land than he did. His remaining 6 horses were the only thing keeping him from complete ruin, and even they were getting thin on the sparse grass his overgrazed pasture could offer. He was 42 years old and felt 70, worn down by a territory that gave nothing and took everything. The storm hit on Tuesday, sudden and vicious the way desert storms do. Rain came sideways, turning the world into gray sheets of water that made seeing 10 feet ahead impossible. Marcus had been riding fence line when it struck, trying to patch holes before the horses found them and wandered off. He'd given up and turned for home, soaked through and miserable, when he saw the figures stumbling along the wash. At first, he thought it was an animal. Then the lightning flashed, and he saw it was a boy. Apache, maybe 12 years old, clutching his arm against his chest and moving with the jerky desperation of someone running on pure will. The kid's face was twisted in pain, his clothes torn and muddy. When their eyes met across the rain-swept distance, the boy froze like a rabbit that spotted the hawk. Marcus should have ridden on. That would have been the smart play. Apache children meant Apache warriors nearby, and getting involved in tribal affairs was a good way to end up dead or worse. The territorial tensions had been rising for months. Settlers and Apache were one misunderstanding away from open war. But the boy was hurt badly. Marcus could see that even through the rain. The way he held his arm, the paleness under his brown skin, the shaking that wasn't just from cold. And something about the kid's eyes, that fierce determination not to show fear, reminded Marcus of his own son, lost to fever years ago. Damn it, Marcus muttered to himself. Then louder, over the rain. But you need help. The kid didn't understand English, or pretended he didn't. He took a stumbling step backward, nearly fell, caught himself. His injured arm dangled uselessly at his side. In the next lightning flash, Marcus saw bone white against torn skin. Marcus dismounted slowly, hands visible and empty. Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you. He pointed at the arm, then at his horse, then toward his ranch. The universal language of someone offering shelter. The boy's eyes darted around, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. He was too hurt to run, too proud to beg, and too young to hide the terror underneath the warrior's mask he was trying to wear. When Marcus took another step forward, the kid swayed on his feet, consciousness flickering like a candle in wind. Marcus caught him before he hit the ground. The boy fought weakly, making sounds of pain and protest, but he had nothing left to fight with. His body went slack in Marcus's arms, passed out from shock and exhaustion, and the rain still hammering down on both of them. Getting the kid onto the horse was a nightmare. Marcus ended up lifting him like a sack of grain, settling him face down across the saddle while trying not to jostle that broken arm. The boy came to halfway through the process and screamed, a sound that cut through the storm and Marcus's heart at the same time. I know, son. I know it hurts. We'll fix it. Just hold on. The ride back felt like crossing an ocean. Every step the horse took made the boy whimper or cry out. Marcus kept one hand on his back, keeping him steady, keeping him from sliding off into the mud. His mind was already racing ahead to what came next. He had some medical supplies, enough to splint a broken arm if he was lucky. Whiskey for disinfectant. Laudanum for the pain, though not much. What he didn't have was any idea how to contact the Apache and let them know their boy was safe. And the longer he kept him, the more likely this ended with warriors showing up assuming the worst. His ranch appeared through the rain like a ghost ship in fog. 2 buildings, both sagging under the weight of years and poverty. The house had a leaking roof he couldn't afford to fix. The barn had gaps in the walls wide enough to see through. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Marcus carried the boy into the house and laid him on the kitchen table, the only surface solid enough and large enough to work on. In the lamplight, the kid looked even younger than Marcus had thought. Maybe 11. His face still had that softness that boys lose when they become men. Someone's son. Someone's brother. Someone's whole world. The arm was broken clean through about 3 inches above the wrist. Marcus had seen enough ranch injuries to know it needed setting fast before the swelling got worse. He gathered his supplies, whiskey, clean rags, 2 straight pieces of wood from a broken chair, leather straps. Then he stood over the unconscious boy and said a prayer to a God he hadn't talked to in years. Please let me not make this worse. When he poured whiskey over the wound, the boy's eyes snapped open. He screamed again, trying to pull away, but Marcus held firm. Easy, son. Easy. I'm trying to help. The boy said something in Apache, rapid and panicked. His good hand grabbed Marcus's wrist with surprising strength, fingernails digging in hard enough to draw blood. His eyes were wild with pain and fear and the certain knowledge that he was at the mercy of a stranger from the people who'd been taking his land for decades. Marcus kept his voice calm and steady. You're safe, hey. I promise. I'm going to set this arm and then you're going to rest. Nobody's going to hurt you. He had no idea if the tone carried meaning across the language barrier, but something in the boy's face shifted slightly. Not trust, exactly. More like the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be another cruelty in a world that had shown him plenty. The actual work of setting the bone made Marcus sweat despite the cold. He'd done this once before, years ago, on a cowhand who'd been thrown from a horse. But that man had been drunk enough not to feel much. This boy felt everything, and trying to straighten the bone while he thrashed and screamed was like wrestling a wounded animal. When the bone finally clicked into place, the boy went rigid and then limp, passed out again from the shock. Marcus worked quickly, splinting the arm between the wood pieces, wrapping it tight but not too tight, elevating it on folded blankets. His hands were shaking by the time he finished. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cold rain still hammering on the roof. He carried the boy to his own bed, the only one in the house, and covered him with every blanket he owned. Then he dragged a chair next to the bed and sat down to wait. Either the fever would come and he'd fight it, or the boy would wake up and Marcus would figure out what to do next. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, Marcus watched a child's chest rise and fall and wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. The boy slept through the rest of that day and into the night. Marcus kept vigil, checking the splint, feeling for fever, making sure the kid was still breathing. Around midnight, those eyes finally opened again, clearer this time, more aware. They found Marcus sitting in the chair and went immediately wary. Marcus raised his hands slowly. It's all right. You're safe. The boy's eyes moved to his splintered arm, then around the small bedroom, taking in every detail. Calculating, planning, looking for exits and weapons and angles. Too much wisdom in those young eyes. Marcus stood carefully and mimed drinking. The boy watched him with the intensity of someone trying to spot a trap, but when Marcus brought water to his lips, he drank desperately. When Marcus offered dried meat, the boy hesitated long enough to make Marcus eat a piece first before accepting it. They sat in silence while the boy ate. Marcus tried to think how to communicate the basics. You're hurt. I helped you. Your people are probably looking for you. I don't know how to let them know you're here. Finally, the boy spoke. One word, his voice rough from screaming earlier. He pointed at himself. Kaya. His name. He was telling Marcus his name. Marcus touched his own chest. Marcus. Marcos. The pronunciation was careful, the syllables foreign in his mouth. Kaya pointed at his arm, then at Marcus, then made a gesture that looked like thanks or acknowledgement or maybe just recognition that Marcus had tried to help. His face was still guarded, but some of the raw fear had faded. Over the next 2 days, they developed a rhythm. Marcus would check the splint, bring food and water, keep the fire going. Kai would accept the help with visible reluctance but growing trust. The language barrier meant their communication happened in gestures and tone and the slow building of understanding between two people who had no choice but to rely on each other. On the second night, Kaya's fever spiked. Marcus spent hours pressing cool cloths to his forehead, forcing water down his throat, changing sweat-soaked blankets. The boy thrashed and called out in his sleep, words Marcus couldn't understand but recognized as names. Family, probably. People who were missing him, searching for him, fearing the worst. Around dawn, the fever broke. Kaya woke clear-headed and looked at Marcus with something new in his expression. He reached out with his good hand and grabbed Marcus's sleeve, pulling him closer. Then he did something unexpected. He pointed outside, to the east, and held up fingers. 5, then a fist, then 5 again. Many. He made a motion like riding horses, then pointed at himself, then at Marcus, then drew a finger across his throat. Marcus's stomach dropped. They're coming, and they think I hurt you. Kaya nodded vigorously. He pointed at Marcus, then at the door, then made a pushing motion. Go, run, save yourself. How long? Marcus asked, holding up fingers. How long until they get here? Kaya looked at the window, at the dawnlight just starting to break. He held up one finger. 1 day, maybe less. Marcus sat back in his chair, the weight of it settling on him. He should have seen this coming. Of course the Apache was searching for a missing child. Of course they'd track him here eventually. And when they found Kaya in a white settler's house with a broken arm, no explanation would matter. They'd see what they expected to see. Another crime in a long list of crimes against their people. Kaya was staring at him with desperate intensity. The kid pushed himself up despite his weakness and grabbed Marcus's shirt with his good hand. He repeated the gesture. Go. Run. Now. Marcus looked at this boy who'd been ready to face death alone in the storm rather than trust a stranger. Who'd fought through pain that would make grown men weep. Who was now, after everything, trying to save the man who'd saved him. No, Marcus said quietly. I'm not running. Kaya's eyes went wide. He shook Marcus, speaking rapidly in Apache, his voice rising with urgency and frustration. When Marcus still didn't move, the boy's face crumpled. Tears spilled down his cheeks, not from pain this time, but from the terrible knowledge that Marcus was choosing to stay and die because leaving meant abandoning him. Marcus caught Kaya's hand gently. It's all right, son. Whatever happens, it's all right. You're safe. That's what matters. He had no illusions about what dawn would bring. The Apache would arrive in force. They'd see their injured child in his house. And Marcus Reeves would die trying to explain something that needed no explanation in his own heart. He'd done the right thing. He'd save a child who needed saving. If that was what it cost, then that's what he'd pay. Kaya cried himself back to sleep eventually, exhausted from the fever and the emotion. Marcus returned to his chair and waited for the sun to rise on what would probably be his last day alive. He thought about his wife, buried on the hill. His son, lost to sickness. He'd be joining them soon. At least he'd be able to face them knowing he'd stayed true to the man they'd loved. The dawn came slow and golden, and with it came the sound of 500 horses. Marcus heard them before he saw them. That deep rumble in the earth that meant an army was coming. He walked to the door, his legs steady despite the fear racing through his blood. When he opened it and stepped out onto the porch, the sight that greeted him nearly drove him to his knees. Warriors covered the hills surrounding his property. Not dozens, hundreds. They sat their horses in perfect formation, weapons ready, faces painted for war. The morning sun caught on rifle barrels and spear points and the silver conchos on their clothes, turning the whole scene into something from a dream or nightmare depending on which side you stood on. Marcus stood on the side that was vastly outnumbered and completely outmatched. In front of the assembled warriors, one man rode forward. He was older, his face marked with the kind of authority that couldn't be faked or given, only earned through years of leadership. Eagle feathers decorated his hair. His bearing commanded respect from every warrior present. This was a chief, possibly the chief, and he'd come personally for his missing child. The chief stopped his horse 30 feet from Marcus's porch. Their eyes met across that distance, and Marcus felt the full weight of judgment in that gaze. This man was measuring him, deciding whether he lived or died, whether this ended in blood or something else. Marcus didn't reach for a weapon he didn't have, didn't try to explain or defend himself. He just stood there, a poor rancher in work clothes that had seen better days, waiting for whatever came next. The chief gestured, and immediately warriors dismounted. They moved toward the house with purpose, and Marcus stepped aside to let them enter. Fighting now would help nothing and no one. If they were here to take Kaya home, then Marcus would let them take him home. Inside, he heard Kaya's voice, loud and urgent. The boy was awake and talking rapidly, explaining, defending. Marcus caught his own name in the stream of Apache words. Marcus said with an emphasis that made it sound important. The warriors emerged moments later, and between them they helped Kaya walk out into the morning light. The boy was weak, leaning heavily on their support, but his eyes were bright and alert. The splint on his arm stood out white against his skin, obvious proof that someone had tried to help rather than hurt. The moment the chief saw Kaya, his entire face transformed. Relief, joy, and fury all fought for dominance. He dismounted and strode forward, pulling the boy into a careful embrace that avoided the injured arm. He spoke rapidly, checking Kaya over, examining the splint, his hands gentle despite the anger in his voice. Then those eyes cut to Marcus, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees. Kaya grabbed his father's, and Marcus now understood that's who this was. The chief was Kaya's father. Armin spoke urgently. He pointed at Marcus, at his own arm, at the house. He was telling the story, explaining what had happened. But the chief's face remained hard, skeptical. He walked toward Marcus, and every warrior's attention focused like a spear point. The chief spoke, his English heavily accented but clear enough. My son tells me you helped him, that you set his arm, gave him shelter, kept him safe. He paused, and the silence felt dangerous. Why would a white settler help an Apache child? Marcus met his gaze steadily. Because he was hurt and needed help. That's all the reason I needed. That's all. The chief's tone carried disbelief and something else. A test, maybe. You didn't think about the reward? About using him to negotiate? About the danger to yourself? I thought about a kid with a broken arm dying in the rain, Marcus said quietly. Everything else seemed less important than that. The chief studied him for a long moment. Then he turned and spoke to his warriors in Apache. Several of them looked surprised, even shocked. But they followed his orders, moving to their horses and beginning to unload supplies. My son says you gave him your bed, your food, your medicine, the chief said, turning back to Marcus. He says you stayed awake through his fever, that when he tried to warn you to run, you refused to leave him. His jaw tightened. He says you are different from other white men he has heard stories about. I'm just a man who did what needed doing. No. The chief shook his head. You are a man who chose compassion when fear would have been easier. Who risked your life for a child not your own, from a people you had every reason to fear. He placed his hand over his heart. I am Takoda. Kaya is my youngest son. You saved his life when you could have left him to die or worse. Warriors began bringing supplies forward. Horses, strong, healthy horses that could pull a plow or carry a rider for days. Blankets woven in patterns Marcus had never seen. Dried meat and grain enough to last through winter. Tools that gleamed in the sunlight. Clay pots filled with herbs and medicines. Leather pouches heavy with what looked like gold. Marcus stared as his failing ranch transformed before his eyes. This is too much. I didn't do it for payment. I know, Takoda said. That is why we give it. You acted with honor when no one was watching. You showed mercy when you could have shown cruelty. Such actions create debts that must be honored. More warriors came forward, bringing supplies that Marcus couldn't even name. They worked with military precision, turning his sparse homestead into something that could actually sustain life. The horses he'd been losing to poverty would be replaced. The tools he'd been making do without would be available. The food shortage that had been gnawing at him would be solved. My people and I have been watching the settlers take our land for many years, Takoda continued, his voice lower now. We have seen violence and broken treaties. We have buried our dead and mourned our losses. When Kaya went missing, I feared the worst. He looked at his son, then back at Marcus. Finding him alive and cared for by someone like you has reminded me that not all settlers are the same. That perhaps there is still hope for peace between our peoples. Kaya broke away from the warriors supporting him and walked to Marcus. The boy was unsteady, but determined. When he reached him, he did something that made Marcus's throat tight. He took Marcus's hand and placed it on his own chest, over his heart. Then he said something in Apache, the words formal and weighted with meaning. He says you are his brother now, Takoda translated. That you will always be family to our people. That your honor is his honor, and his protection is your protection. Marcus looked down at this fierce young boy who'd tried to face down a storm with a broken arm rather than show weakness. Tell him the honor is mine. When Takoda translated, Kaya smiled, the first real smile Marcus had seen from him. Then the boy hugged him, careful of his injured arm, and Marcus felt years of loneliness crack open inside his chest. Takoda placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder. You will always have safe passage through our territories. If you are ever in need, send word to any Apache you meet and we will come. We do not forget our debts or our friends. Then they were preparing to leave. Kaya was lifted carefully onto a horse, settled behind a warrior who would keep him steady on the journey home. The massive formation of warriors began to organize themselves, preparing to depart with the same precision they'd arrived with. Marcus watched them go, watched Kaya turn back and wave with his good hand, watched 500 warriors who'd come prepared for war ride away in peace. The dust they raised caught the morning light and turned everything golden. When they finally disappeared beyond the hills, Marcus stood alone in front of his transformed ranch. The supplies surrounded him, evidence of honor repaid, of mercy rewarded, of a choice made at the right moment for the right reasons. He was still poor by most measures, still alone, still working land that barely sustained him. But he was richer than he'd been 3 days ago in ways that couldn't be counted in horses or grain or gold. He'd learned that kindness could bridge impossible distances, that doing the right thing when it cost everything could bring rewards beyond imagining. That one moment of compassion could change the course of history between peoples who'd been fighting for generations. Marcus Reeves turned back to his ranch, ready to rebuild with the gifts he'd been given. The loneliness would return eventually. It always did. But for now, he had purpose, he had resources, and he had a story he'd carry forever about the storm that brought him a child who needed saving and the dawn that brought 500 warriors to say thank you. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny meet in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.